the idea.
And we can skip it.
Let me turn this off like this. Yeah. It's good. I don't know. Maybe we could walk us through some training. Because I come to whoa. I am regular I don't think it has anything to do with that.
Nice to meet you.
I didn't even know that was there. That was my.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Where's the
Sounded like it.
Go back to that last one that you did.
Oh, I just heard something there. Let's continue.
Go back to the second one.
This one? I wouldn't be sitting here with Sunday best if I wasn't.
Trying to build suspense. Thank you for your help.
You lawman or an outlaw?
Bit of both, I reckon. I need a man with a good gun and a straight spine. You up to the task? I wouldn't be sitting here with Sunday best if I wasn't.
Around these parts, we might be men. They're just killers. All thieves.
I took an oath to protect everyone. I ain't about to quit this.
You find a home for yourself, what would you do to hold on to it, to protect it?
You get to the count of 5, get the hell off my leg.
Lady, you got 2 shells in that bird killer.
And I just shoot you twice. Just to be safe.
How do I get to do what you do? You're loyal. You ain't afraid of once. The real power lies beneath the badge. Ready to ride?
I thought you'd never ask.
I'm warning you. Your wicked days are done.
Oh my God.
When you don't need audio, it kicks on. All right, so you're familiar with the Lone Ranger?
Yes.
All right, so
Yes, you have to be that old.
we think, those of us who have been studying Bass Reeves history, think the Lone Ranger, Bass Reeves was the inspiration for the character the Lone Ranger. There's no definitive evidence for that. But let's just think about some of the similarities. What we know about the Lone Ranger, it came out in Detroit, for example, on the radio. And that's where the penitentiary was, where the prisoners who were found guilty in Fort Smith would go. So is it possible that Bass Reeves' connections, and he did travel there on at least one occasion as a bodyguard for prisoners on a train? Were stories passed down about him there? I don't know. We don't know for sure. But in case you're not that familiar with him, all right, so Lone Ranger is hiding his identity, kind of a weird reason. He doesn't want to take credit for the good deeds he does. There's no reason why he needs to blend in. And he can't blend in. Look at him. Can this guy go into a bank anonymously? So Bass Reeves knew when he accepted the oath of being a deputy U.S. Marshal. I forgot. I have this. Bass Reeves knew that he could use his own skin color to his advantage, his camouflage. There hadn't been black lawmen, before him, or, he was one of the first. He was beaten back, for a couple of months by somebody else, but, people didn't expect a black lawman. And so, instead of just wearing his badge on his coat and showing how macho he is and daring people, to duel him. No offense about dueling. But he thought, this is probably a safer job if I just mosey up to people. They don't even know I'm a lawman. I pretend to be maybe a cowboy, just looking for some food or companionship or whatever. Maybe he's a vagrant, homeless, out of, down on his luck. Starts talking to these outlaws, and before they know it, when their guard is down, he strips them of their weapons, he arrests them. And Bass wanted to make a lot of money. He had 10 children at home and a wife that you saw portrayed, Jenny. And you could make quite a bit of money rounding up these felons, collecting the bounties. At that time, the lawmen didn't collect a salary. They'd collect the bounties. So if he collected 500 on this one, 1,000 on this one, 2,000 on these guys over here, filled up his wagon, went home, he might make $5,000 on one trip in the 1870s and 80s. So it was to his advantage too, as a black man. I think he was pretty wise in knowing, political winds shift, they change. The newspapers write about what the lawmen are doing, whom they're killing. So what if they get tired of this black lawman arresting and killing prominent white men in the community? On one occasion, when he arrested Jim Webb, the man he described as being the meanest man he ever had to deal with, a man who was guilty of killing his black neighbor for starting a fire that got out of hand and it crossed property lines and it burned up some land that the cattle needed, and Jim Webb was a foreman on a prominent ranch. He got so mad he killed his neighbor. So Bass Reeves arrested, consider this, in 1883, a black lawman arresting a prominent white man for killing a black man. That's really goes against everything I thought I knew about American history. Historians, fiction writers, poets, I hadn't seen anything like this. That's why I got so obsessed with it. Now, Bass Reeves would prefer nonviolence to violence, like the Lone Ranger. He preferred to wear disguise, like the Lone Ranger. He didn't have silver bullets. Who could afford silver bullets? But he did have this little trademark. If someone helped him, gave him some information that was helpful in tracking someone down, he'd pull out a silver dollar out of his coin purse. And so his trademark was giving a silver dollar. He also often rode a gray mare, silver, whitish, very similar to this white horse. He also liked sorrels, and sorrels as they age can often become gray mares. So there are lots of similarities. This man, as you saw in the clip, you saw Bass Reeves he's speaking to Native Americans for collecting information. He's got a sidekick there like Tonto in the Lone Ranger story. Bass Reeves depended on the Native Americans. And Bass Reeves actually had learned all the languages of the 5 civilized tribes of Indian Territory. Once he escaped slavery, he hid out in Indian Territory, hid among the Native Americans who were the friendliest, and those were the Seminoles from Florida. And the Seminoles had, as a part of their culture, an openness for intermarriage among the native Seminoles and slaves or freedmen who were freed slaves, and they lived together harmoniously. So they wouldn't have seen Bass Reeves showing up out of the blue as an enemy. So he saw it as his goal. Let me get to Indian Territory, make it to Seminole Nation, and I'll earn my freedom. And that's what he did. By first beating up his master, who was a prominent officer, Confederate officer, but not tough enough to beat Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves was 6'2", a very strong individual, taller than most men were in that age. In that day and age, the average white man was like 5'7.5", 5'8". So he was definitely an imposing individual. And when Bass was later riding, pretending to be a cowboy or pretending to be a vagrant and riding through Indian Territory, looking for a felon who's hiding to preserve his anonymity, to make himself invisible so no one could see him coming, he would try to shrink his body as much as possible and hunch over his horse. And he would ride an old horse. He wouldn't ride one of the fine quarter horses that the all marshals and deputies could receive. He wanted to look the part. He didn't want to be a threat to anyone, and that's one reason why I greatly admire him. I admire, as a creative writer, I admire his imagination and his dedication to just carry out a creative role. He was an actor. So, is he the Lone Ranger? I can't say for sure that the writers of the Lone Ranger appropriated his story, but I can say that no one else resembles the Lone Ranger in real life like Bass Reeves does. So if you're looking for a real hero, turn to Bass Reeves, really a precursor of the civil rights movement, if you think about it. Here's someone preferring nonviolence to violence. The turn the other cheek philosophy of Martin Luther King's preachings, teachings for his civil rights workers. He really believed in justice and wanted everyone to have a chance in court if they were willing to let him give them a chance. If they insisted on a fight, he'd fight. All right. I'd like to give you kind of an insight into how I perceived he was brought up. There were gaps in his story. We knew more about Bass Reeves as a lawman due to his being a witness on trials for those he arrested, and newspaper reporters writing about him, and because there were interviews of people that he worked with, we know about him from his adulthood as a lawman. We knew less about him in terms of how he grew up. Now, we do know some family stories that were shared, passed down, that he grew up in Van Buren, Arkansas, and the family moved, when the Reeves family moved to Texas, and he had a strong family network that looked after him. His mother, he didn't have his father on the plantation. He was sold away. In case you're not aware of this, but during times of slavery, it was common for slave masters to break up families, split the parents up, sell children away. They were trying to demoralize their slaves so they would work. They wouldn't live for any other reason but to work. So he did have his grandfather and grandmother on the plantation. His grandfather was the personal servant to the master. His mother was a personal servant or slave for the mistress of the plantation. His aunt sewed for the family and shared in the cooking responsibilities with Bass's mother. So he grew up, and this may sound odd, but he grew up with, if you could say an enslaved person has some privileges, he had some privileges. That he got to live and work around those in power so he could learn from them. He could learn what they knew. They wouldn't teach him how to read and write, but he could hear them communicate, hear their conversations. He could learn their philosophies. And sometimes they would share stories, share insights with him, not knowing how he could possibly use those later. But the upbringing, how did he grow up having so much faith in himself? And I felt like I needed to kind of sell that in this book. Otherwise, I felt like the readers would just find him too unbelievable. He learned to respect white people's time above all else. They were busy running the plantation. His grandfather explained how such work required the focus and patience